Yet another awesome episode of Alone Season 9 to get to talk about. Once again, so much going on, and I'm just so impressed with all of the folks on this season. So I'm going to be talking about all of the things we're seeing. I'm also going to be talking a bit about food preservation and cold smoking versus hot smoking and some of the different smoking techniques we're seeing. I'm going to be talking about calories and food and storing food versus eating it. I'm going to be talking about feelings of isolation in society versus in nature. And at the very end of both parts 1 and part 2 in this review of episode 6, I'm going to be talking about this idea that alone is nothing but a starvation contest, and talking about a little bit more of the particulars around that idea. First off, oh my gosh, I just have to say, I feel like there's unprecedented success happening on this season so far. We're at day 31 by the end of episode 6, and we still have 7 people out there, which is really impressive. And I feel like that is a new record for Alone. I haven't actually gone back through and looked, but usually we see people coming out a lot more regularly, and already early on we've had 2 episodes where nobody went home. So very impressed with everybody and the incredible skills that we're seeing. Yet again, I just like everybody out there and feel really good about most of the choices that folks are making. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into more of the particulars and dig into some of these details. We come in to see Terry working on a smoker for his beaver meat, and really a fan of how Terry is going about building his smoker. So Terry, using solid logs as opposed to boughs like we saw Benji doing, is going to be holding a lot more of the smoke in with the meat, so it's much more airtight. At first I was wondering if he actually had a cold smoker setup with smoke coming in by a tunnel, because I could see some smoke in the background, but I think he just had a fire going to get some coals to put into the smoker. Something that's really important to think about is the difference between cold smoking and hot smoking. Hot smoking is something that we would do to give a smoky flavor to something, like for barbecue, and it's not something that's ideal for drying meat, because there are different types of bacteria that attack meat, and there are some that eat just raw meat, and those kind make toxins that will make you sick, but heat destroys those toxins. So if you cook well raw meat, even if it's been starting to break down through bacterial action, it's still going to be safe for you to eat. And we heard Tom talking about this in an earlier episode. The type of bacteria that eat meat that has already been cooked are a different kind of bacteria, and they make a different kind of toxin as a byproduct of their eating that meat, and that toxin is not broken down by heat, which basically means if you are trying to preserve meat long term, you do not want it cooked before drying it, because you're setting yourself up for those bacteria that can do you real harm, and that no amount of cooking the meat afterwards is gonna destroy those toxins. So you want to cold smoke your meat if you're looking to preserve it long term. And I really appreciate that Terry talks about this specifically. So it's really a balance when you're out somewhere like Alone in a wet climate to have enough heat produced by your coals, by your smoker, that's going to be drying your meat, but that isn't actually going to be cooking it in the process of drying it. So we see Terry cutting up his beaver meat very, very fine, lots of small pieces to put into that smoker, which I think he's doing an awesome job, much more thoroughly than Benji was doing. And what Benji was cutting, in terms of the footage that we actually saw of this, it doesn't mean it's all that Benji did, but he was taking the muscles that make the abdominal cavity, which are thin, and just cutting that, but that isn't actually slicing through the grain of the muscles, and so it's going to take a lot longer for something like that to dry because it's got the membrane intact, versus what Terry's doing, which is cutting through the muscle grain, making very small, fine slices. So he's hanging lots of small pieces, and he's got a great rack system set up where everything is nicely spaced, and he's got a lot of places for that meat to hang, which means all of those many pieces can be cut small, which means they're going to dry way faster, hopefully without requiring as much heat, and he's going to get a nice even smoke and an even dry, because it's a bummer to have thick and thin pieces and pieces that dry at different rates, because it means you have to really over smoke the first pieces in order to get those thicker pieces fully dried and smoked. And smoke is a preservative because it's a little antibiotic, in other words, anti-biological life. It keeps the bacteria down, but it's also not good for you to be eating meat that's really, really strongly smoked. You can get an upset stomach, and essentially you can be tanning your own stomach lining if you're eating really, really strongly smoked meat and nothing but it, which is what a lot of the people out there are looking at, right? They're mostly getting the meat that they're preserving, and so that makes it that much more intense on your system to be eating over smoked meat. So I really appreciate that Terry says it. He says he's looking for many, many hours at low, low heat, making sure that he gets that cold smoked meat rather than hot smoked meat. Really important distinction that I don't see a lot of people mentioning or paying a lot of attention to. So way to go, Terry. It's looking really good. As always, please remember to subscribe to my channel, like the video, and hit the little notifications bell, and check out my Patreon membership. We've still got, I think, 5 Season 9 participants coming on our Q&A calls live for my Patreon members. Love those beautiful earrings that Tom is making for his girlfriend. I'm sure that's going to be a very, very special memento, and it's a lovely sentiment. Love hearing him talk so much about his sweetheart. And I feel like this time period, around the 30-day mark, is when that loneliness that really comes to you missing your significant people in your life comes in. We saw the kind of loneliness and brain shift where people start using we and our a lot more instead of I, me, my around day 20. And now we're seeing people really thinking about specific people they're deeply missing. We see Tom checking his trap line and disappointed that he doesn't have anything in it, and talking about how he's got 4 snares and nothing in it. And I so get the disappointment. Also, 4 snares isn't actually that many. We like to think in trapping about, say, 20 to 30 snares in order to get something in them every day. And even with 20 or 30, oh my gosh, I have not had the experience of bringing in something every day, even with that many. So 4 is really not all that many. And I'm a little bit curious about Tom's snaring, and super exciting, Tom is going to be on my Patreon call next week. So we're going to get to ask him specifics about the trapping he was doing out there. But it looks to me that he is using powered snares for all of his snares, which means a spring pole or some twitch up mechanism that's lifting the animal up and off its feet. And that would make it make sense why he has only 4 at this point, because the powered snares take so much more time and energy to set up. It's much more limiting where you can set them up, and there's a lot of mechanics to figure out. So I would say you can set up 1 powered snare in an hour and probably 15 just snare wire snares in an hour. And I know this because in the Arctic on season 6, I did not have snare wire. For some reason, the show never emphasized that, and they made it seem like my snaring was just like everybody else's, but it wasn't. I was doing all of my snaring with fishing line and parachute cord. So they had to be powered to get that animal up and off its feet, or else it could have just reached around and snipped the fishing line. I know because I tried it without them being powered, and sure enough, everything just chewed their way out. So I do think that powered snares can be more effective, but it's also a time and energy equation. And given that he has snare wire, he doesn't have to be doing just powered snares. He'd probably be much better off setting up 10 times more than those powered snares. And we saw this with Teimojin in an early episode too, doing the L7 type of twitch up snare. Great, and they can be super effective, and sometimes something that wouldn't be quite caught in a standard snare will get caught in your twitch up, but given they take so much more time and energy and there's so many limitations, it's not what I would have focused on out there in Tom or Teimojin's position. I really appreciate hearing Tom talk realistically about his physical frame out there, and that he is not someone who is built for a starving contest, that he is someone who absolutely has to be bringing in food regularly out there. That's just the reality of his frame and his metabolism. And I pointed this out in the first time we got introduced to Tom, right? He looks like he has a slight build, and he looks like he didn't manage to put on any extra weight going in, particularly compared to all of the other folks out there who go in looking pretty beefy. So we are already hearing Tom talk about it and seeing in his face, on his frame, the degree to which he has lost not just a lot of weight, but enough weight that he's starting to really feel it in his body. He's feeling really fatigued, and he just needs more energy than he's getting. I'm going to be circling back around to this and the idea of Alone as a starvation contest later in part 2 of this episode's review. Also, I had someone comment on one of my other videos about Tom using river cobbles for his fireplace, and it's true that that can be a danger. Rocks that have been in water can still have little pockets of water inside, and when they get heated in a fire, they can explode and be a real danger. That said, given that Tom's is built into a chimney with clay and that it doesn't look like there are any rocks just right in the coals, besides the ones on the bottom, but those ones are protected from exploding because they're built within a fireplace. So the rocks that are in the fireplace up above that bottom layer, I don't think they're going to be getting the kind of heat that's going to be making them a danger for explosion. That's more when we're thinking about rocks that are right in a fire, like for doing a sweat lodge or a sauna, where the rocks themselves get glowing hot. The issue is if the whole mass of the rock can get hot enough that the water trapped inside could turn to steam because it expands dramatically when it becomes steam, right? So that's what causes that explosion. So looking at it, I don't really feel like Tom's fireplace is a major explosive rock danger. We then come to Teimojin in his shelter, talking about the mice being a problem and talking about making a Paiute, which I think he's using as short for a Paiute Deadfall. And we've heard a lot of references to Paiute Deadfalls in Alone in general, and one this season Adam had in his application footage and his kind of scenes from back home, Paiute Deadfall. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about what that means and how they work. So I'm not going to go into detail about setting up a Paiute Deadfall because that would be a whole separate video on its own, but I just want to do a little demo so that you understand what it is that Teimojin's talking about. So a Paiute Deadfall is a style of trap. A deadfall is what we call something that the weight itself is the trap mechanism, so it's a crushing type of trap as opposed to a snaring type of trap. So the Paiute Deadfall is a way of getting a rock suspended up above the ground with bait underneath it with a trigger mechanism sensitive enough that if something comes and nibbles at the bait, it's going to trip that trap and have the rock fall and crush them. And it's more complicated than you might think because you need a rock that is heavy enough to crush the creature after, that is flat enough on the bottom that it's for sure going to make contact and not have a little hollow where they can hide out and be wounded but not killed or not injured. And then also it needs to swivel easily, so it needs to have a relatively flat side so it's going to drop straight as opposed to off to one side. So finding the proper rock can be a trick. So to set up a Paiute Deadfall, you need the right shaped rock. You need a ideally Y-shaped stick is a great way to go. And then a stick that is heavy enough to hold your rock up when it has weight on the back end of the stick. And so what you need in order to apply the weight on the back end of the stick is cordage. So this is the trick. There are some deadfalls that don't require cordage, but the Paiute Deadfall does. You can make cordage out of your own hair, out of some vegetative matter, inner bark, grasses, lots of different things are going to have cordage potential, but you have to have some. So then you're going to have a string that's attached to the back end of the stick that goes around, wraps around the upright portion of your Y-shaped stick, and then has a toggle at the end that is pressed on by a long bait stick that goes underneath the rock and is caught on the underside of the rock. So the mechanism is that when the critter is under here and chews on the bait, it's going to move the bait stick, which will then stop pushing on the toggle, which will release the tension on the cordage, which is tied to the back end of the long horizontal stick, and that is going to release that stick, which will bring the rock down. So it's actually not super easy to put together because there's so many different moving parts and everything has to have just the right tension and balance. And it's hard to set up because with only two hands holding all of those pieces separate, it's not an easy thing. It definitely takes some practice. So I'll be excited to see Teimojin set it up and hopefully see him getting those problem mice out of the way. We see Teimojin dealing with one of those classic Alone struggles, which is losing arrows and whether or not it's worth taking shots that are difficult shots, and particularly shots that are straight up. I've talked about this a bunch, I experienced this a bunch, and we hear Teimojin talking about it again and saying, you know what, I'm going to stop taking the high shots because it's just not worth it. It would be one thing if you had unlimited arrows, but you only have 9 arrows, and so it is a big risk, especially if the game isn't that large. So to risk an arrow for a squirrel or a grouse when you could get a beaver or a bear with it that is way more food, it's a big risk. So I agree with him in choosing not to keep taking shots up high. We also hear Teimojin talking about times in his life when he has felt a lot more isolated than he does out there on alone. And I really love that he brought this up because that's so much my experience. Being alone and lonely in society when you are surrounded by people but you feel isolated and not connected to them is so much more emotionally challenging than being isolated in nature. For me, and for a lot of people who find solace and connection in nature. And I believe that that can be true of anyone who really puts time and energy towards building those kinds of connections with nature, with learning about the natural world, with really observing it closely. Speaking of which, I've got a little fly on my lens right now. So I am observing nature closely and encouraging this fly elsewhere. I never felt lonely on season 6. I felt so connected to that landscape. There was so much to pay attention to, so much to be curious about and learn about, that loneliness wasn't really an issue. I thought about people and I missed people, but it wasn't the kind of heartbreaking loneliness and isolation that I have sometimes felt in our culture, being surrounded by people who I didn't get and didn't get me, and who my values were so deeply, deeply different from. So love that Teimojin brings this in. Back to Tom getting ready to go out and stake out the beavers early morning. He's talking about the fact that beavers are mostly nocturnal, crepuscular too, very active at dawn and dusk, but of course you can't shoot them at night when you can't see them. So the best time is the early morning, and that's what everybody's been doing. And oh my gosh, so far 2 people have been successful. So really hoping that Tom gets successful with this one. So Tom's getting ready to go out and be out at that beaver location at first light. And he's sitting there, and it looks to me, between the footage of him sitting there and the footage of him starting to walk out as the light comes, that he built a blind, which is awesome and something that we haven't seen a lot of on Alone. So love that. And I'm coming to really appreciate Tom more and more with every episode. I love him talking about coming to hunting from a place of conservation, and the idea that he spent years just observing animals and being curious about their habits and feeling like he understood them. I think it's such an important point, and I really appreciate him making it, how important it is to pay attention to the animals all seasons of the year, not just hunting season, to really understand their biology, their behavior, their motivations. That is going to make you a way better hunter, and you're going to be better able to predict what the animals are going to be doing, how to get the best shot, and what they might do if you do injure them, as in fact he does with this beaver. And he's saying, man, I bet it's going for its dam, right? Because that is a thing that beavers do. They dive and they feel safe down there. In these scenes with Tom talking about the beaver, we can really see how gaunt he is getting, right? We can see divots in his cheekbones where the flesh is already really sinking in. So just like Tom being concerned about him getting food, I'm really concerned about Tom, and definitely think that of anyone out there, he really needs to be successful the most. He needs that beaver. It's affecting his energy levels. It's affecting his body physically really intensely. So, oh my gosh, really hope that he gets that beaver. And it's hard to tell, right? It's really hard for us to tell from the footage whether or not he lands that shot. But certainly the beaver, we can see thrashing a bit in the water. And so that's a really good indication that he did. And then not long after he gets that shot off, we see the arrow rise up to the surface of the water. Not sure if everybody caught that, but you distinctly see it bob up and float. So this is probably a graphite arrow that's hollow in the middle, as opposed to a wood arrow that's solid, because it would still float, but it wouldn't bob up to the same degree. So when Tom is saying, I know I stuck it. He's saying, I know I shot it. And then when he's saying, I'm pretty sure I got passed through, what he means is that the arrow passed all the way through the beaver. Otherwise, it wouldn't have bobbed to the surface, right? It would be in the beaver. So that's a sign that it was a really good shot that hopefully is doing enough damage to kill that beaver. That said, the beaver's gone, so we don't know. And just because it passed all the way through, it doesn't necessarily mean that it hit vitals. It would really need to hit the heart or the lungs to be a killing shot. If he got it lower, if he hit it through the spine, which it looked like from that angle and that shot, that definitely could have been what he did. So that would paralyze the animal, but not necessarily kill it right away. It will kill it eventually, but not necessarily right away. Or if he got a gut shot, that again, it's going to take that animal a while to bleed out. So we're really hoping that he got a good lung or heart shot and that beaver is going to be coming up to the surface, just like Benji's and just like Terry's did. So really, really hoping for you, Tom, and really, really identify with him talking about what a terrible feeling it is to be in a situation where you feel like you have to take a shot, even if it's not a great shot and not a shot that you would take in a different situation, and then to feel that you have wounded, potentially mortally wounded that animal and not retrieve it. It feels terrible because you've done harm to that thing, and obviously it's terrible to know that there's food available and that you do not get that food. So we saw that a bit in this episode, and it's a terrible, terrible feeling. It also feels important to point out that Tom is talking about the food value of that beaver realistically. He's saying, that beaver is about 5 days worth of food for me, and I need that food. And I really appreciate that, because we've heard people not talking realistically about the food value of the game in earlier episodes, and we're going to be hearing about it again in this episode. Speaking of Tom's nature observation and being really aware of wild creatures and their habits, extra points to anyone who can guess successfully what creature did this to the log behind me. The first person who gets it right in the comments, I will send you a link to one of the recorded videos of my Patreon calls, which are usually exclusive to my Patreon members. We circle back to Terry getting the meat out of his smoker, and success. It looks awesome. That is what lots of very thin sliced small pieces of meat will do in your smoker, right? So great success. Love that system he has where he can lift the whole rack out easily, and you can just see how absolutely thrilled and elated he is at his successful job at preserving that meat. Really love the way Terry went about it with eating the meat off of the bones. We saw him eating the skull and the brain right away. So that is definitely what you want to do. Cut the big muscles up, and then all of the little bits that are fattier or have a lot of membrane or are really tightly attached to the bones, those are the things you want to be cooking and eating first. And loved seeing Terry eating that brain, really important source of fat and calories. And the eyeballs, I've read that there are some native peoples up north who save the eyeballs and the fat behind the eyeballs for the pregnant mothers and the young children. That is how critical that fat in particular is. It has a lot of really important nutrients, not just the calorie value. Love Terry's reference to the Burns Beaver Kitchen and cooking up that beaver bacon. It looks amazing, and he is so right that fat is just everything in a wilderness situation. And when we are well fed in our normal lives, it's really hard to understand in that visceral way how critical fat is when you are working hard in the wilderness in a cold environment. So love seeing Terry just relish that delicious beaver bacon.